What if the enemy you feared most treated you with respect? What happens when the lines of war blur and humanity shows up where you least expect it? In a world built on prejudice, could one soldier's dignity change the course of history? This is the story of courage, empathy, and the moments that proved respect knows no color. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. The letter arrived on a windless summer morning, sealed in a plain envelope that carried more weight than its modest form betrayed. James Rivers, known to most as Jim, stood barefoot on the porch of his mother's weather-worn home in Charleston, South Carolina, the rough wood boards warm beneath his feet. He opened the envelope without ceremony. The words were clear, unflinching. He was to report to Camp Claiborne within the week. The United States Army had called him to war. Jim didn't flinch. He had expected it, perhaps even willed it into being. At 22, his life had already been a quiet struggle. He had known the labor fields, the sweat of cotton under the southern sun, the clenched jaw silences of men who knew their worth but had no room to speak it aloud. He had grown up in the shadows of stories, whispers of black soldiers in the Great War, men who wore the uniform and came back to a world that still crossed the street to avoid them. But still, they wore it, and so would he. His mother, Lena Rivers, watched him pack with hands that never stopped moving, folding, tucking, smoothing. Her silence was not of disapproval, but of history. She had seen 2 uncles vanish into World War I, return broken in ways they never spoke of. Now her son, tall and thoughtful, with the same furrowed brow of his father, would vanish too. "You ain't fighting for them," she said quietly. "You fighting to be seen." At Camp Claiborne, Jim was one among hundreds, black recruits packed into separate barracks, issued worn gear, addressed by white officers who rarely met their eyes. There was pride in their posture, but it came with the weight of knowing they were considered less than. They trained hard, harder than most, because to fail was to confirm what the system expected of them. Jim was assigned to the 512th Quartermaster Battalion, a logistics unit. It wasn't frontline glory, but it was war all the same. Unloading supplies under fire, clearing the wounded from smoking fields, enduring shell shock and silence alike. But to him, there was dignity in the work. The Army wouldn't give him a rifle, but it had given him a place. For now, he wrote letters in the dark, careful words to his mother, describing the camp in half-truths. He did not mention the slurs muttered by officers, or the way white soldiers laughed when he saluted. He did not say that some German POWs would later eat at tables where he was not allowed to sit. Instead, he wrote of determination, of duty, of sunrises over pine barrens, and the solemn pride in the voice of the chaplain who prayed before deployment. In December 1943, his orders came. Destination, Europe, assigned to support operations near the Western Front. He boarded the transport ship with a satchel of letters, a pair of scuffed boots, and a small leather-bound Bible his mother had slipped into his pack. As the ship pulled from harbor, he stood on the deck and watched the coastline fade. Somewhere beyond the gray horizon was a continent in ruins, cities bombed into silence, and millions of lives displaced by ambition and hatred. And somewhere out there, Jim Rivers would serve not just as a soldier, but as a quiet challenge to every lie America had told about men like him. The war had begun long before he was drafted, but now it was his turn to answer it. The Atlantic was endless, a gray expanse that stretched beyond sight, and the ship seemed to drift through a world suspended between fear and anticipation. Jim Rivers stood among the other men, their voices a low murmur, their hands clenching railings as if grasping for some sense of stability. The air smelled of salt and diesel, but beneath it, there was the subtle, unshakable tension of a war zone awaiting them. For Jim, the journey was more than a passage across the ocean. It was a crossing from one kind of confinement into another, from the known limits of the American South into the unknown hierarchies of Europe at war. When the ship finally docked in England, the cold hit him first, sharp, unyielding, a reminder that this was no longer his home. The soldiers were immediately absorbed into a system meticulously ordered yet palpably indifferent. White officers moved with precision and authority, their eyes brief, assessing, rarely meeting those of the black troops. Jim felt the familiar weight of scrutiny and dismissal, a silent chorus telling him he belonged, but only partially. He reminded himself that the work mattered, that every supply carried, every wounded man assisted, was a defiance of the assumption that black soldiers were lesser, unfit for responsibility, unworthy of recognition. He was assigned to a logistics hub near the English coast, a place where the hum of activity never ceased. Supplies poured in from the docks, crates of ammunition, medical equipment, rations for the front. Jim and his men moved through the chaos with precision. The work was grueling, their bodies pushed to limits that felt endless. Yet, in those moments of labor, there was an unspoken camaraderie among the soldiers, a shared understanding that survival and honor were intertwined. It was in the quiet solidarity, the knowing nod, the brief laugh under breath, that they claimed a small, private victory over a world that had long underestimated them. Letters from home arrived sporadically. Each one was a reminder of the life he had left behind, of a South that would never fully accept him, no matter the medals he might earn or the battles he might survive. Yet the letters also carried hope, his mother's prayers, his sister's encouragement, a promise that he carried not only the uniform of a soldier, but the legacy of resilience embedded in generations of his family. In the shadow of war, these fragments of home became a tether, a quiet force that anchored him amidst the chaos of preparation and anticipation. Rumors of German prisoners being transported to nearby camps reached him early on. Jim had heard stories from fellow soldiers, whispered in corners, about the peculiar treatment of these prisoners, how they were often better fed, better clothed, and afforded privileges that black soldiers could only dream of. There was a bitter irony in it, one that Jim carried silently as he trained, lifted, and marched. The world demanded valor from him and his brothers, yet often denied them the most basic acknowledgement of equality. As weeks passed, the anticipation of deployment built a persistent, almost suffocating pressure. Jim learned to move with deliberate caution, to observe before acting, to understand the unspoken codes of a military that demanded obedience while concealing bias behind orders and protocol. He found small ways to assert his presence, small victories of competence and reliability that could not be erased. Each crate unloaded without complaint, each injured soldier assisted with steady hands, became a statement of capability, a quiet rebellion against the limitations imposed by color alone. Then came the orders that would change everything. Transfer to France, to a region scarred by retreat and devastation, to a field where German prisoners of war had been confined. Jim felt the weight of responsibility settle deep in his chest. This would be more than a test of skill. It would be a test of character, of endurance, and of humanity, in a place where both were often denied. The journey from the docks to the war-torn countryside was silent but charged, each mile carrying him further into a reality that demanded he confront not only the enemy, but the contradictions of the world he served. In the chill of dawn on his first day in France, Jim Rivers understood the scope of what awaited him. The war was no longer distant. It was immediate, pervasive, and unyielding, and he would have to find his place within it, not just as a soldier, but as a man determined to assert the dignity of those who had been long denied it. Every step, every breath, every decision now carried the weight of history and expectation. The landscape stretched before him, a somber palette of gray and muted green, scarred by trenches, debris, and the faint echoes of battles recently fought. The air was thick with smoke and memory, a reminder that survival alone was not enough. He would have to navigate a world that refused to see him fully, yet depended on him completely. Each day would test him. Each encounter would demand he balance caution with courage, obedience with principle, and fear with an unrelenting drive to prove his worth, not just to the army, but to himself, and to every life he might touch. The first night in France, under a sky veiled with clouds and the distant rumble of artillery, Jim lay awake and considered the path that had led him here. He thought of the South, of the lessons etched into him by hardship and resolve, of his mother's quiet wisdom, and of the promise that his presence here meant more than service. It meant representation, challenge, and the possibility that respect could exist, even in the most improbable places. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of history settle upon him, a mantle he could neither refuse nor relinquish. The war had arrived, and with it, his trial had begun. The first day at the camp felt like stepping into a world deliberately constructed to remind Jim Rivers of his place. The fences stretched into the horizon, barbed and unyielding, and the barracks rose like gray monoliths, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The air smelled of damp earth and machinery, of fuel and the faint, bitter tang of fear. Soldiers moved between buildings with the rigid precision of men trained to obey. Yet beneath the surface, there was an invisible hierarchy that no drill could erase. Jim knew it well. Black troops were often assigned menial tasks, denied the privileges afforded to their white counterparts, and constantly reminded of a status imposed not by merit, but by color. He accepted it as a challenge, a crucible through which his dignity would have to shine without recognition. The camp was already alive with whispers and rumors. German prisoners, men who had once marched with rifles aimed at freedom's defenders, now lived under strict regulations, yet received rations and comforts that Jim and his fellow soldiers could only imagine. It was a bitter irony. The enemy treated better than the men defending the country's ideals. And still, Jim approached his duties with careful attention, unloading supplies, assisting medics, and cataloging equipment with a meticulousness that allowed no room for error. Each day, he measured himself against the demands of the camp, against the subtle hostilities of officers, and against the unspoken expectation that he would remain invisible. In the shadows of the barracks, he heard stories from fellow soldiers, tales of valor and small acts of defiance that went unnoticed by command. Some spoke of carrying wounded comrades across shell-ravaged fields, of quietly correcting mistakes that could have endangered entire units. Jim listened, absorbing each anecdote like fuel. He understood that survival was not only a matter of endurance, but of intellect, of timing, and of a quiet resilience that refused to be recognized but would not be broken. He began keeping a small journal, scribbling notes about routines, discrepancies, and the patterns of human behavior he observed. It became a sanctuary of order in a world deliberately chaotic. Despite the relentless work, the camp offered glimpses of humanity. He noticed moments when officers, usually curt and dismissive, nodded at a well-executed task or allowed a weary soldier a brief respite. These were rare, fleeting, but significant. Jim understood that acknowledgement, even minimal, could be leveraged into influence, a currency that allowed small victories in an environment designed to suppress agency. Yet, the most profound moments occurred in unexpected places. One afternoon, as he assisted in transporting supplies to a holding area, he overheard a group of German prisoners quietly discussing the impossibility of their defeat, the disbelief that men like him could enforce order, organize labor, and navigate authority with precision. The astonishment in their voices was unmistakable, a recognition of competence that his own superiors had not yet offered. By the second week, Jim had begun to map the rhythms of the camp, the predictable oscillations of guards, the unspoken rules of interaction, and the subtle openings for exerting influence without confrontation. He observed the prisoners closely, noting their fears, their routines, and the ways in which despair could be managed or mitigated. It became clear that command over circumstance was not solely a matter of rank, but of perception and patience. He learned to anticipate movements, to act before he was ordered, to seize initiative quietly, and to measure the reactions of those around him with precision. Late at night, Jim reflected on the paradox of his situation. He was both enforcer and subordinate. A man entrusted with responsibilities denied him elsewhere. The contradictions gnawed at him, but they also sharpened his resolve. Each day became a test of willpower, a silent contest with prejudice and circumstance. He moved with the weight of history pressing against his back, but also with the conviction that he could carve a path of dignity through a world that sought to deny him. In those hours of solitude, he allowed himself fleeting pride, a recognition that competence could never be erased, even if acknowledgement was withheld. And yet, beneath the routines and strategies, there was an unease he could not shake. The camp was alive with suppressed emotion, fear, resentment, bitterness, and the faint glimmer of hope. Jim felt it in the way a prisoner hesitated before speaking, in the tension of guards' shoulders, in the quiet resignation of fellow soldiers. Every act, every word, every decision mattered. Survival demanded more than physical endurance. It demanded psychological acuity, moral resilience, and the ability to navigate a landscape of contradictions that seemed designed to break him. By the end of his first month, Jim Rivers understood that the camp was more than a place of containment. It was a crucible. Here, he would confront the darkest aspects of human nature, witness the fragile boundary between cruelty and compassion, and discover that respect was not given lightly, even in war. And in the quietest moments, as he prepared for another day, he allowed himself a dangerous thought, that perhaps, in this strange, ordered chaos, he could shape outcomes in ways the world had never expected from a black man like him. The camp was a landscape of repetition, routines etched into every stone and plank. Yet that monotony was broken one morning by the arrival of a new unit. They came quietly, their boots echoing against the gravel in measured cadence, and among them was a woman whose presence seemed to bend the very air around her. Eleanor Powell, an Army nurse assigned to the United States Army Nurse Corps, had been transferred to the camp to oversee the medical care of both soldiers and prisoners. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture unwavering, and her eyes carried a clarity that cut through the exhaustion and tension that had become the camp's constant companion. Jim noticed her immediately, not merely for her stature or the precision of her movements, but for the aura of authority and empathy she carried, qualities rarely afforded to women, and even less to women of color in this war-torn world. She moved among the injured and the weary with deliberate care, each gesture measured, each word chosen, as though the act of acknowledgement itself could heal wounds that medicine alone could not touch. Soldiers whispered her name, but there was a respect that bordered on reverence. For Jim, watching her navigate the camp with quiet command, it was as if she embodied the possibility of dignity in a world structured to deny it. Eleanor's first days were filled with assessments, the relentless mapping of injuries, and the allocation of scarce resources. Jim was assigned to assist her, a detail he approached with a mixture of professional discipline and personal curiosity. Every movement he made was a testament to competence honed by necessity. Every instruction she offered became a lesson in precision, authority, and the subtle art of command in a place that constantly tested both. They moved together through wards and holding areas, a rhythm of efficiency and mutual understanding that required no overt acknowledgement, yet forged a bond of respect. The prisoners, too, were acutely aware of her presence. There was a tangible shift in the camp's atmosphere as she entered spaces where despair and resentment had long settled. German soldiers, men who had once wielded rifles with lethal intent, regarded her with a combination of disbelief and curiosity. Here was a woman, black and unassuming by the world's standards, yet exercising control in a manner that commanded obedience without fear. Jim observed their hesitation, the subtle stiffening of posture, the cautious glances exchanged when she spoke. It was clear that her authority disrupted expectations, and in that disruption, a fragile order began to emerge. One afternoon, as Jim and Eleanor moved through the medical tent, a young German prisoner broke down, tears slipping unchecked down his face. He had been injured days before, left in pain and uncertainty, and now found himself tended by hands he could not have imagined treating him with care. Eleanor's voice was calm, unyielding, and gentle. "You are human. That does not change here." Jim watched the exchange, feeling a surge of something he had not anticipated, a mixture of pride, astonishment, and the faintest flicker of hope. He realized that her presence, and the way she exercised it, was rewriting the unspoken rules of the camp. In the evenings, after the day's duties ended and the camp settled into uneasy quiet, Jim found himself reflecting on Eleanor's impact. It was more than authority or skill. It was the assertion of humanity in a place designed to erode it. Her actions were a reminder that respect could be extended across lines thought unbridgeable, and that dignity could be maintained even when the world sought to deny it. Jim felt a quiet determination growing within him, a recognition that the principles she embodied could guide his own actions even in the harshest circumstances. By the end of that week, the camp had shifted imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. The prisoners moved with slightly less fear, the soldiers carried themselves with a hint more confidence, and Jim himself began to understand that the most profound forms of power did not require violence or rank, but presence, consistency, and unflinching moral authority. In this convergence of purpose, he sensed the fragile emergence of something extraordinary, the possibility that even in a place defined by control and confinement, respect could transcend expectation, altering the course of every interaction that followed. As night fell, Jim lay on the cot assigned to him, listening to the distant murmurs of the camp. He thought of the soldiers who had arrived with him, of the prisoners who regarded him with cautious eyes, and of Eleanor, moving tirelessly among them all. In that moment, he understood that the war was no longer solely about strategy or survival. It was about the quiet assertion of humanity, about demonstrating that even in the shadows, dignity could prevail. And for the first time since his arrival, Jim Rivers felt the weight of possibility pressing gently, insistently, against the confines of a world built to deny it. The camp had settled into a rhythm of rigid routines and quiet tension when the incident occurred that would linger in Jim Rivers' mind long after the war. It was a gray afternoon, clouds heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind carried the bitter scent of smoke and damp earth. Jim was assigned to distribute medical supplies with Eleanor Powell, moving through rows of tents where prisoners and soldiers alike waited with a mixture of apprehension and fatigue. The air was thick with unease, a palpable sense of expectation that something small, almost imperceptible, could shift the fragile balance of control within the camp. A group of prisoners, recently transferred, were huddled near the far tent, their movements cautious, hesitant. Among them was a young woman, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn scarf. She had been brought with others for quarantine and care, her presence raising whispers among the guards. Jim felt the tension immediately. She was not an officer, not a soldier, but her very existence seemed to disrupt the order everyone had learned to maintain. He approached with care, aware that any misstep could provoke hostility or panic. Eleanor stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her voice calm, yet unwavering. "You are human. You are safe here." The words seemed almost absurd in their simplicity, yet they carried an authority that the prisoners could not dismiss. Jim watched the woman's eyes, wide and glistening, as the tension in her shoulders slowly gave way to an incomprehensible mixture of relief and disbelief. She lowered her gaze, tears spilling silently, and for the first time, Jim saw the raw impact of empathy delivered without pretense, without expectation. The act of recognition, simple, unwavering, had broken through layers of fear and suspicion. Jim felt a surge of emotion he had rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. He had witnessed cruelty and indifference throughout the camp, seen prejudice exercised with quiet precision by officers and soldiers alike. Yet here was an unassailable truth. Compassion, executed without hesitation, commanded a respect that force could never inspire. He recognized in Eleanor's gestures a demonstration of courage equal to any battlefield heroism, an assertion of humanity that demanded acknowledgement, even from those who had once wielded weapons against it. The young woman, still trembling, managed a fragile nod, her lips barely forming words of thanks. Jim could see the conflict in the surrounding prisoners, a hesitancy born of years conditioned to distrust and fear. Yet, despite the uncertainty, a subtle shift had occurred. The camp, momentarily suspended in the tension of possibility, had witnessed a disruption of expectation. Authority and care exercised by someone the world had long deemed incapable of either. Jim realized that his own actions now mattered in a new dimension. He assisted Eleanor with precise attention, offering aid to the prisoners with a calm that mirrored her example. Each motion, each careful word, became part of a larger narrative, a demonstration that respect and competence were inseparable, and that courage could manifest in ways that the world rarely recorded. He felt the weight of history pressing upon him, a reminder that small gestures in extraordinary circumstances often carried consequences far beyond their immediate context. Throughout the afternoon, the camp seemed quieter, more tentative, as if the acknowledgement of shared humanity had left an invisible trace on the tents and the men and women within them. Jim observed the prisoners' subtle glances, their cautious movements, the tentative sense of trust beginning to form where none had existed before. He recognized that this moment, so fragile, so easily overlooked, was extraordinary precisely because it was unexpected. Respect had emerged in a place designed to deny it, and for Jim Rivers, the realization was both exhilarating and sobering. By evening, as the gray light dimmed to a muted shadow, Jim reflected on the day's events. The young woman's tears lingered in his mind, a silent testament to the power of dignity and empathy. He understood that the camp would return to its routines, that prejudice and tension would persist, but he also recognized that small acts of humanity could carve spaces of hope even in the most constrained circumstances. In that quiet, he made a silent vow to act with the same unwavering recognition of worth, to ensure that every decision he made honored the possibility that respect could exist where none was expected, and that courage took many forms beyond the battlefield. The following week brought a new assignment that carried a weight Jim Rivers had not anticipated. He was ordered to accompany a small convoy of supplies to a section of the camp housing high-ranking German officers, men whose uniforms still bore the insignias of a regime that had waged terror across Europe. Jim knew the historical and personal implications of this task. These were men who had once fought to destroy the ideals he now defended, yet they were to be treated according to the rules of war. The irony was not lost on him, and neither was the tension that coiled in the air like a living thing. As he approached the officers' quarters, Jim felt the gaze of every man in his unit. There was curiosity, doubt, and a subtle undercurrent of expectation. They were watching not only the prisoners, but him, a black soldier carrying authority in a space dominated by men who had previously wielded power over countless lives. It was a test in itself, unspoken yet palpable. Each step he took resonated with the awareness that competence would be measured not just in action, but in presence. He reminded himself that confidence, precision, and restraint were as necessary as courage. The officers awaited him in a dimly lit room, their faces etched with exhaustion, pride, and disbelief. One man, a colonel, leaned back in his chair, his uniform rumpled, but his posture still commanding. His eyes, sharp and calculating, rested on Jim, scanning him as if trying to reconcile expectation with reality. The colonel's lips parted, and in English, heavily accented but clear, he said, "Sergeant Rivers, thank you. Without men like you, none of this ends." The words struck Jim with an unexpected weight. Recognition, from the very enemy he had been taught to fear and despise, arrived not as submission or surrender, but as acknowledgement of skill, dignity, and resilience. Jim's hands remained steady as he delivered the supplies, each movement deliberate, measured, respectful. The colonel and his aides observed in silence, an unspoken communication passing between them, the acknowledgement of competence and humanity beyond color, rank, or past enmity. Jim could sense a tension easing in the room, a subtle transformation that reminded him that authority, when exercised with clarity and fairness, commanded more than obedience. It demanded recognition. Yet beneath this momentary accord lingered the shadow of history, the knowledge that these men had been architects of destruction, and that his presence here was a quiet act of balance, a demonstration of restraint and judgment in a world that had often denied him both. The encounter lingered in Jim's thoughts long after he returned to his barracks. He reflected on the paradox of war, of fighting for principles that were inconsistently applied, and of discovering respect in the most improbable circumstances. The colonel's words, simple yet profound, weighed heavily upon him, shaping a new understanding of his own capacity to influence, to assert dignity, and to command respect without demanding it. He began to see that the war was not merely a series of battles on foreign soil, but a confrontation with the very assumptions that had defined him, his peers, and his nation for generations. That night, under the muted glow of a lantern, Jim considered the lessons embedded in this interaction. The men he served alongside, the prisoners he encountered, and the officers who had once dismissed him now existed in a delicate balance of expectation and acknowledgement. He understood that competence and morality were intertwined, and that moments of recognition, even from those considered enemies, could carry a transformative power that resonated far beyond the immediate context. Jim also realized that his role in the camp had evolved. He was no longer simply a soldier following orders. He had become a measure of human capability, a bridge between worlds divided by prejudice, and a subtle force capable of demonstrating that authority and compassion could coexist. In the quiet of his quarters, he resolved to navigate the delicate interplay of power, respect, and humanity with unwavering resolve, knowing that the smallest gestures could alter perceptions, shift allegiances, and, in ways that might never be recorded, leave an indelible mark upon history. The weight of responsibility settled upon him like a mantle, both demanding and invigorating. Jim Rivers understood, with a clarity that would not fade, that the war was no longer only a test of strength, it was a test of principle, of the courage to act with integrity even when the world seemed determined to deny it, and of the capacity to find and extend respect where it had never been expected. Despite the small victories and moments of recognition, Jim Rivers could not escape the pervasive shadow of prejudice that lingered in the camp. Every day carried reminders that his presence, his competence, and his humanity were constantly measured against a society that deemed him less. Orders were clear, yet the implementation was steeped in unspoken hierarchy. Black soldiers assigned to manual labor, while white counterparts performed administrative or supervisory tasks, privileges withheld, and respect meted out selectively, like a fragile ration. Even outside the boundaries of the camp, segregation remained unyielding, a reminder that the world Jim fought for was not yet ready to acknowledge him fully. Rumors reached him about the prisoners' perception of the camp's structure. German officers and soldiers, once feared enemies, occupied areas and enjoyed resources that black soldiers could never access. It was a bitter irony that gnawed at him silently as he moved through his daily tasks. They were the vanquished, yet often treated with deference, while he and his peers, defenders of liberty, were relegated to the margins. Jim bore the tension quietly, channeling frustration into meticulous work, each movement precise, each duty executed with unwavering commitment. There was a lesson here, he realized, in surviving indignity without surrendering integrity. Among his peers, conversations were guarded yet candid. Soldiers shared stories of exclusion, whispered of privileges enjoyed by prisoners that they themselves could not claim. Yet, beneath the frustration, there was resilience, small acts of defiance, moments when discipline became assertion, when competence could not be ignored. Jim listened and contributed, recognizing that collective perseverance was itself a form of resistance, a way to assert value in a system determined to deny it. He began mapping the subtle power dynamics, learning when to push, when to yield, and how to assert influence without provoking retribution. It was in these calculated movements that Jim began to understand the duality of war. The visible battlefront was only part of the struggle. The other fought silently within the boundaries of human interaction, authority, and prejudice. Every task, delivering rations, assisting medical personnel, moving prisoners, became an arena where dignity was negotiated, where competence could subvert expectation, and where small gestures of humanity carried weight far beyond the immediate context. He recognized that in every encounter, he was not only executing orders but also challenging assumptions, reshaping perceptions, and creating the possibility for respect where it had never been offered. The prisoners themselves were not immune to these dynamics. Some looked upon the black soldiers with incredulity, a mixture of fear and astonishment at men performing with precision and authority where social codes of race had dictated they could not. Others remained indifferent or hostile, their conditioning too ingrained to allow immediate acknowledgement. Yet Jim observed closely, noting subtle shifts, a nod here, a hesitation there, a careful compliance that signaled recognition, if not full acceptance. Each observation became a tool, a measure of influence that could be leveraged to maintain order and assert fairness within the camp. Evenings brought reflection and quiet contemplation. Jim thought of the disparities, the inequities, and the lingering bitterness of a system built on division. But he also noted the glimmers of hope, moments when humanity pierced the rigid hierarchy, when empathy was demonstrated without compromise, when small victories hinted at the possibility of broader change. He realized that endurance required more than physical resilience. It demanded intellectual acuity, emotional control, and moral clarity. Every choice carried consequences, every interaction a potential pivot in the balance of respect and prejudice. The weight of history pressed upon him constantly. Jim understood that the racism embedded in the camp mirrored the larger world, a world still divided by arbitrary measures of worth. Yet he also recognized that his presence, his actions, and his example were forces of quiet transformation. In the unrelenting tension of each day, he found purpose to endure, to excel, and to assert the humanity denied to him and those who shared his struggle. It was a war within a war, fought not with rifles or grenades, but with dignity, competence, and the unwavering refusal to accept subjugation. And in that struggle, Jim Rivers discovered a strength that would sustain him through every challenge that lay ahead, a strength rooted not in recognition, but in the integrity of his own actions. Winter arrived with a ferocity that the camp had not fully anticipated. The wind cut through layers of wool and canvas, carrying with it the sharp scent of frozen earth and smoke. Illness began to spread among both prisoners and soldiers, a relentless wave of fever, chills, and coughing that seemed to reach every tent and barracks with indiscriminate reach. The medical staff, already stretched thin, struggled to manage the increasing cases. Jim Rivers found himself thrust into a role that demanded more than physical labor. It required vigilance, judgment, and a calm presence that could stabilize those teetering on the edge of despair. Eleanor Powell, tireless and unwavering, worked long hours, tending to the sick and wounded with precision and care. Jim assisted wherever he could, carrying supplies, helping lift patients, and maintaining records with meticulous attention. But soon, the strain became visible even in her composed demeanor. Her hands shook slightly as she administered medicine. Her voice bore a fatigue that no amount of resolve could entirely mask. Observing her, Jim felt a surge of responsibility that went beyond duty. He recognized that her safety, her stamina, and her ability to care for others depended on his intervention. He became the anchor she could lean on, guiding her through the chaos, distributing tasks, and ensuring that the most critical patients received attention first. The prisoners, for their part, were caught in the same web of vulnerability. Injuries that had long gone untreated worsened under the harsh conditions, and disease spread rapidly in overcrowded tents. Jim noted the hierarchy among them, the subtle interplay of fear and desperation, and began applying the lessons he had learned in navigating authority and respect. He approached each case methodically, balancing discipline with compassion, understanding that the smallest gestures, a cup of water, a blanket, a quiet reassurance, could have disproportionate impact on morale and compliance. He witnessed the tension ease in moments when care was applied without condescension, when respect transcended the barriers of enemy and prisoner, black and white, soldier and nurse. One afternoon, a particularly severe outbreak threatened to overwhelm the infirmary. Jim and Eleanor moved with coordinated efficiency, their actions almost instinctive after weeks of observation and shared labor. He lifted patients, guided nurses, and documented symptoms while monitoring resources, ensuring that medicine and supplies were allocated where most effective. In those hours, Jim realized that leadership was not a title, but an execution of competence under pressure, a steady hand amidst chaos that commanded respect not through fear, but through reliability and integrity. The officers, both American and German, observed the operation with growing awareness. Even the previously skeptical colonel recognized the value of Jim's composure and decisiveness. For the prisoners, who had long expected contempt or neglect from black soldiers, the actions of Jim and Eleanor disrupted entrenched assumptions. Fear slowly gave way to tentative trust, astonishment softened into cautious acknowledgement, and the balance within the camp subtly shifted. It was a demonstration of authority and humanity intertwined, a lesson in dignity enacted in real time, with consequences that were profound, yet often invisible. By the end of the day, the infirmary was stabilized, though exhaustion pressed on every individual present. Jim felt the weight of responsibility acutely, aware that the work had extended beyond mere survival to an assertion of moral principle. He had acted not only for duty, but to safeguard the well-being of others, regardless of nationality or rank, and in doing so had reaffirmed the notion that courage took many forms. It was quiet, uncelebrated, yet transformative. That night, Jim reflected on the fragility and strength of the human spirit. The sacrifices made in those hours, the choices to act decisively amidst uncertainty, and the recognition that empathy could wield authority as effectively as any weapon, resonated deeply within him. He understood that these moments, fleeting, intense, and morally complex, would define not only his experience in the war, but the legacy of what it meant to confront adversity with integrity. In the silence, he felt a measure of clarity. That true strength lay in the courage to act with compassion when no one was watching, and that even in a world fractured by hate and fear, humanity could be asserted, moment by moment, through the unwavering commitment to do what was right. The first hints of spring brought a fragile light to the camp, pale and hesitant, yet sufficient to signal change. Orders came down that prisoners would begin repatriation, their transfer to ports and transport vessels organized with meticulous care. Jim Rivers felt the tension shift immediately. What had been a space of rigid routines and controlled hierarchies was now alive with anticipation, anxiety, and the subtle stirrings of hope. For the German prisoners, liberation meant return to a world still reeling from devastation. For the soldiers, it marked the nearing end of a period that had tested every measure of endurance, patience, and moral courage. Jim moved among the soldiers, ensuring that logistics were executed flawlessly, that prisoners were prepared for transfer, and that medical care continued uninterrupted. The routine was familiar, yet underlaid with a new urgency. Every step carried the weight of transition, the necessity of maintaining dignity during a process that could easily descend into chaos. He noted the prisoners' expressions, observing the mixture of relief, fear, and disbelief etched on their faces. Many, who had once wielded authority with brutality, now regarded him with a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition born not from victory or defeat, but from witnessing competence and fairness sustained throughout the hardships of war. Among those departing was the young woman Jim had seen weeks earlier, the one who had cried in response to Eleanor Powell's quiet assurance of safety. She approached him as the lines were formed, her eyes wide, voice trembling, yet carrying the fragile strength of gratitude. "Thank you," she said, simple words that contained years of disbelief, fear, and relief. Jim nodded, understanding that acknowledgement could be a more powerful form of communication than rhetoric or force. Her gaze, steadying as it passed over him, affirmed what he had long suspected, that acts of humanity could ripple beyond expectation, shaping perception in ways history might never record. The German colonel from the previous encounter also awaited transfer, his demeanor composed yet observant. As Jim oversaw the preparations, the colonel's eyes met his once more, and in that moment, a silent respect passed between them. There were no words necessary. Each had witnessed the capacity for discipline, integrity, and courage in the other. Jim understood that this acknowledgement carried weight, not merely in the camp, but in the larger narrative of the war, in the quiet assertion that valor and competence were not confined by race or past enmity. As the prisoners were loaded onto trucks, the soldiers began to feel the first real sense of closure, though exhaustion and reflection weighed heavily. Jim remained vigilant, ensuring every detail was accounted for, aware that the act of departure carried symbolic as well as practical significance. The camp, once a microcosm of hierarchy, tension, and constraint, had shifted imperceptibly under the force of daily diligence, humane intervention, and unwavering competence. Respect had emerged in unexpected quarters, altering perceptions, bridging divides, and creating a legacy of recognition and dignity. When the final vehicles departed, a quiet descended upon the camp. Jim lingered for a moment, reflecting on the weeks of labor, observation, and moral negotiation. He thought of the prisoners he had guided, the young woman who had wept, the colonel who had silently acknowledged his authority, and the countless small decisions that had shaped the flow of events. Each memory carried a weight, a proof that perseverance, respect, and moral clarity could leave traces even in a world structured to deny them. Soon, orders came for the soldiers' return to the United States. Jim embarked on the journey home, the Atlantic stretching before him as it had months earlier, yet the landscape of his mind was profoundly altered. The war had ended, but its lessons persisted, that courage encompassed more than battlefield action, that respect could be forged in adversity, and that humanity, exercised consistently, had the power to transform both the observer and the observed. He carried these truths quietly, knowing that the home he returned to would not yet recognize them fully, yet confident that the imprint of his actions would endure, long beyond the confines of the camp and the fleeting reckoning of war. In those hours at sea, Jim contemplated the paradox of victory and endurance, the tension between expectation and acknowledgement, and the subtle but enduring assertion that one man's integrity could create reverberations far beyond immediate circumstance. He understood that his experience in the war had defined him not by the battles he fought, but by the respect he commanded and extended, and by the humanity he insisted upon preserving even when the world seemed determined to deny it. The journey home was not an end, but a continuation of that assertion, a passage into the world beyond the camp where the true measure of courage and dignity would continue to unfold. Years later, Jim Rivers found himself in a quiet room, the walls lined with books, photographs, and memorabilia of a life that had been shaped by war, duty, and the unrelenting pursuit of dignity. He was older now, his hair streaked with gray, his hands carrying the subtle marks of labor and experience. Yet the memory of the camp, the prisoners, and the extraordinary moments of recognition remained vivid, as if etched into the very fabric of his consciousness. He could recall the young German woman who had wept at Eleanor Powell's words, the colonel whose respect had been earned through steady competence, and the countless small interactions that had defined his service far more than any battle ever could. In the post-war years, Jim had dedicated himself to causes that extended the principles he had defended abroad. He helped establish organizations for Black veterans, advocating for equal recognition, fair treatment, and the acknowledgement of service that had too often been minimized or ignored. He spoke at gatherings, recounting experiences of leadership, moral courage, and unexpected respect, emphasizing that the quiet assertion of humanity could be as transformative as acts of valor on the battlefield. He shared stories of camaraderie, empathy, and resilience, highlighting the paradoxes and contradictions that had defined his service. Each anecdote carried not only historical weight, but a lesson in integrity, a call for recognition beyond race and hierarchy, and a reminder that dignity was not bestowed lightly, it was claimed through action. Yet despite these accomplishments, doubt lingered. Jim often reflected on the moments of unrecorded significance, the gestures of humanity that went unnoticed in official histories, the respect that had been offered quietly, yet profoundly. He questioned how many of those moments had truly shaped the people involved, how many had faded into obscurity, and whether the lessons they embodied had survived the passage of time. The young woman's tearful acknowledgement, the colonel's silent nod, Eleanor's tireless dedication, all had transformed the camp in subtle ways, yet history often remembered only the broad strokes of conflict, leaving the nuanced assertions of dignity unexamined. In private, he returned to those memories repeatedly, contemplating the fragility and resilience of human morality under duress. He remembered the camp's rigid routines, the pervasive prejudice, and the moments when courage and compassion intersected to create a space where respect could flourish. Jim understood that these events had shaped not only his own life, but had quietly influenced others, even if the evidence remained invisible to the broader world. He saw the moral victories, the subtle shifts in perception, and the assertions of competence that had challenged assumptions, leaving indelible traces that could not be quantified or celebrated in conventional ways. Jim Rivers recognized that his legacy was not defined by medals or rank, but by the cumulative effect of integrity, leadership, and the courage to act with humanity when it was neither expected nor required. He thought of the soldiers who had served alongside him, the prisoners who had been witnesses to his diligence, and the women like Eleanor Powell, whose example had illuminated the possibilities of respect and moral authority. He understood that the war had tested him not only in skill and endurance, but in ethical clarity, the capacity to act rightly in circumstances structured to challenge morality at every turn. Even as he aged, he returned frequently to the question that had haunted him throughout his life: how much of what was done in courage, empathy, and respect truly survived in the world beyond those moments? The answer was elusive, yet it did not diminish the weight of action itself. Jim knew that, in claiming dignity for himself and extending it to others, he had participated in a subtle but profound reshaping of the human narrative, a testament that the quiet assertion of humanity could endure, even when history failed to record it fully. And in that enduring possibility, he found both solace and purpose, a reminder that the essence of courage and respect transcended circumstance, persisted beyond recognition, and defined the measure of a life lived with integrity. The shadows of doubt remained, but they were tempered by the certainty that the choices made in the crucible of war had been righteous, deliberate, and transformative. Jim Rivers understood that the world would never fully acknowledge every moment of humanity he had witnessed or enacted. Yet the legacy of those actions persisted invisibly, a moral thread weaving through history, unbroken, undeniable, and quietly enduring.